The 8800 GTX. If you were a PC enthusiast back in 2006, this graphics card was considered the Ferrari Testarossa of the GPU world. The card every gamer wanted, but so few could afford. I can remember when this card was released and the sheer impact it had on the GPU market. It was an engineering marvel. The first DX10 GPU, the first NVIDIA card to use a unified shader model, 680 million transistors, and the list goes on and on. But most importantly, performance was downright madness. In many cases, it was faster than NVIDIA's previous flagship, the 7900 GTX, in SLI for that matter. Arguably, this was the best GPU that NVIDIA has ever released, and one of the most legendary GPUs of all time. So here we are, almost 11 years later. Does the 8800 GTX still have any steam left in it today? Or is it better left on a display shelf so most middle-aged hardware enthusiasts can reminisce about the good times? Today we're going to see how well it holds up in some older and modern-ish games. But we won't be reverting to the resolutions of yesteryear. We'll be going all out and testing all of today's games at 1080p. Today's card is one made by a gone but not forgotten company, BFG. BFG was one of the few AIBs to start offering factory overclock cards, much like our sample today. Back in the day, using odd art was considered edgy and cool. For some reason, BFG had a fetish for bald guys that liked touching their head. And this wasn't even their final form. Anyway, this card was purchased used and was in decent shape considering its age. There wasn't a lot of dust, and the thermal pads looked pretty good for their age. The tin was dried up, but that was to be expected. A reference 8800 GTX has a core clock of 576 MHz and a memory clock of 900 MHz, which is 1800 MHz effective. This BFG OC version has a core clock of 594 MHz, while the memory clock had been untouched. I normally include overclock results in my video card lookbacks, but not today, as I didn't want to risk damaging my only working 8800 GTX. Also take note, we're using a different test system today. Alright, well let's jump into some game performance. The first game we're testing is BioShock Infinite, and here we chose the medium preset and ran the built-in benchmark. We averaged 30 frames per second. Frame times were a little wobbly, as we did see some stutter. VRAM usage was close to being topped out as well. Still not a bad result for such an old card. Next up is CSGO. Since I'm terrible at this game, I loaded up a professional match on the train level, which appears to be one of the most demanding levels that I've seen thus far. At the medium preset with no AA and 16x AF, we saw an average frame rate of 53. Also, frame times didn't look that great in some areas of the map, but I also wanted to make a mention that in less demanding maps, our frame rate was well over 60 FPS. Battlefield 4 is the next game we tested. Here we did our benchmarking at the beach portion of the Singapore mission. With the medium preset, the 8800 GTX averaged 41 frames per second. I was surprised how well frame times looked as well, and it didn't even max out the available VRAM. I was very impressed with how this card performed in this title. Next up, I wanted to test Paladins. Since this card doesn't support DirectX 10.1, Overwatch isn't an option. Well, Paladins is a blatant knockoff, but it's fun and it's a free alternative. At the very high preset, we saw an average frame rate of 68. Along with great frame rates, we also experienced great frame times. Assuming you have a decent CPU, this game will run well on most discrete potato GPUs. The Metro series is one of my personal favorites, and today we're testing Metro Last Light Redux. We selected the low preset with everything else turned off. Using the built-in benchmark, we saw an average frame rate of 30. Frame times were pretty good, but we did see some stutter, but it wasn't harshly felt. Also note, when there was a lot of explosions on screen, frame rates did drop into the high teens. GTA 5 is still a must test today, and I wasn't expecting the 8800 GTX to do well here at 1080p. With everything set to normal using DX10, the card averaged 24 frames per second. I benched the game for some time and the experience had some pretty hard drops as shown in our 0.1% lows. But through most of the gameplay, frame times were not too bad. Lowering the resolution to 720p should make for a much better experience, but still not optimal. Stalker Call of Pripyat is an older game that came out a couple years after the 8800 GTX. If you haven't played the Stalker series, then exit out of this video now and go buy Shadow of Chernobyl. It's a great game, and you can thank me later. Alright, well now that you're back, we're using the benchmark tool with high settings and enhanced DX10 lighting. We averaged 56 frames per second. Frame times were not that great, and we did see and feel some stutter. VRAM usage was also being a bit pushed too far. Next up is Tomb Raider from 2013. Here we used the normal preset and tested with the built-in benchmark. We averaged 38 frames per second and noticed great frame times as well. This game still looks great at these settings, and I would certainly call it playable. Now onto a racing game, Project Cars. At 1080p with everything set to low, we averaged 49 frames per second, which is actually really good. The main issue was frame times would spike every time we hit another car or a wall, which in my case was nearly all the time. So if you're a better driver, I would definitely call it playable. And the last game we tested today is no longer a game, but rather a question. A question PC gamers ask themselves every day. Can it run Crysis? Well, to answer the question, I fired up the game at 1080p with high settings, and I found the answer to be, well, no, not really. We only averaged 27 frames per second, which really isn't terrible, and to be fair, I could lower the resolution and drop the settings, but come on, this is Crysis, not Sims 3. You gotta man up. Alright, well that wraps up our game testing. Unfortunately, I didn't collect power consumption stats this go round, but the card only has a TDP of 155 watts, so I would expect it to be very good compared to some of the Fermi cards I've recently tested. Fan noise wasn't bad at all. Keeping the fan set to auto, the card was very quiet under load. And with 100% fan speed, it was kind of loud, but not as bad as you would expect. Well, that wraps up our look at the legendary 8800 GTX. I hope you enjoyed this nostalgic look back and also got an idea on how it performs in various games at 1080p. Color me impressed for an 11-year-old card. If you enjoyed content like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel. And as always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch. F2F out.